Hi again, everyone. Thank you for those of you who are here with us in person, and for those of you who are joining us online via Zoom. Welcome again to our day-long symposium titled "What Can Grenada Teach Us?" Earlier on this morning, we heard from a wonderful panel of community folks involved with the work of the Institute for People's Enlightenment in Grenada. And for this panel, we're going to be hearing from two of our Grenadian thinkers and scholars, Dr. Merle Collins and Dr. Laurie Lambert. And we're titling this panel Feminist Pedagogies, thinking about the Caribbean and thinking about the work of the IPE in the context of pedagogy, community pedagogy, but also to theorize how that work is informed by feminist thinking and generally, and in particular, Grenadian feminist thinking and scholarship. So at this time, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. Before I do that, one little housekeeping matter. At the end of this panel or this reflection, if you have a question for either of our panelists, we're asking you to come up to the front to do so that the people at the fourth space can capture the whole event fully. And so just come up here if you have a question. So Dr. Merle Collins is Professor Emerita at the University of Maryland. For 26 years, she has been a professor in the Department of English, the University of Maryland in the US. For 2 years, she was chair of the university's Latin American Studies Center, now the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center. I have a feeling she had something to do with that. She has widely published novels, poetry, short stories, and critical essays. In the 1990s, she taught at the University of North London in the UK. In the 1970s, she taught high school in Grenada and St. Lucia. From 1981 to 1983, she was a researcher in Latin America for the Grenada Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Her current research interest is in the life and legacy of Louise Langdon Norton Little. I told you before, she's a wonderful inspiration for my work as well. So we're happy to welcome Dr. Merle Collins in conversation with Dr. Laurie Lambert. Laurie Lambert is a Grenadian-born interdisciplinary scholar working at the intersection of literature and history in African diaspora studies. She's an associate professor of African and African American studies at Fordham University. Her first book, Comrade Sister, get it if you don't have it, Comrade Sister, Caribbean Feminist Revisions of the Grenadian Revolution, examines the gendered implications of political trauma on the literature in Grenada. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Laurie Lambert and Dr. Merle Collins for this afternoon's conversation. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tespa. I had some questions for you, Professor Collins. Would you like me to begin that way? Do you think that would work?
I think that would work. And I also have some remarks, so I'm not sure where I say those, but
maybe you want to give those first, and then I can ask you the questions afterward.
Okay, let me say a couple of things then. First of all, of course, thanks to Concordia University, to you, Tespa, and to Tespa's advisor, Professor Nalini Mohabir, for inviting me to take part in this event. And as always, it was a pleasure to hear Peter talk about the work of the Institute. And of course, I've had something of a coordination with, or perhaps communication with Peter and the Institute. And I must say that Peter I think of him as an excellent coordinator, general advisor. We don't always agree. He never admits when we disagree. He just retires and comes with a question in a different way. I really admire Peter's approach to things. So let me just say, and I hope I'm not taking away from your questions here, but I wanted to say that the publicity says that 2023 marks 40 years since the 1983-led US invasion of Grenada. And it points out that this is an important historical political moment. And I always add, this is why I thought, let me say it right at the beginning, and because I always add, it is also 40 years since the whole of that October confusion in Grenada within the local party, the NJM, and the killing of various people. And of course, none of that excuses the US invasion, which was itself an act that I think of as reprehensible, even though I'm conscious that many members of the public did not agree with me. And they did not agree with me precisely. You see, the community did not agree with me generally, I would say, precisely because of the confusion and disappointment with local politics that preceded the invasion. So I thought right at the beginning here, in addition to thinking about the 1983 US invasion, I wanted to mention these names, the people who were killed on October 19th, Keith Haling, Nelson Steele, who in the community we always called Saltfish. Why? I really don't know, but this is not unusual. The nickname is not unusual. Then you have Aline Romaine, Vincent Noel, who was a trade unionist, Avis Ferguson, Eric Dumont, Gemma Belma, Evelyn Bullen, Foreign Minister Unison Whiteman, Evelyn Maitland, Minister of Education Jacqueline Kraft, Fitzroy Bain, trade unionist, Minister of Housing Norris Bain, Andy Sebastian Alexander, Simon Alexander, and of course, Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. So I thought it important to put those names in there too, so that we're thinking, as we think of 40 years, we're thinking not only of the invasion, but also not only of October 25th then, but also of October 19th. Okay. Thanks. I turn over to you now.
Okay. So thank you for that. And, you know, in doing that, you actually kind of embodied two of the first questions I have for you. One is about genre and the other is about context in your work. So maybe I'll start with the genre question. And so you explained that the view that you held of the US invasion of Grenada is not necessarily one that is shared by a majority of members of the community. And I think in your work, you've given us poetry, novels, essays. There are actually a lot of different views of the revolution and a lot of different ways of approaching it that you have taken. And I'm not sure how many people in our audience understand as well the rarity of a writer who can move across these different genres with such facility. So, sometimes somebody's a novelist, or they're a poet, or they're an essayist. But you have been a novelist, a poet, an essayist. You've done the scholarly work. You've done documentaries. And so I wanted to start by asking you, what do you think you've learned as a writer by working across these genres generally, but by returning to the Grenada Revolution repeatedly in these different genres? That's part one of the question. And part two of the question is, can you say something about what you hope we learn as readers engaging you across these different genres?
Okay, thank you for that question, Laurie. And I've heard you described as someone who works at the intersections of literature and history, I think it said. So that I begin with that because it also speaks, I think, to my methodology. I always go back to the historical for my framing. And of course, not of course, but it turns out that I have a particular fascination with Grenada history and politics. So as I move across the different genres, I'm also thinking of which might best fit what I have to say. So that, for example, now I've just finished writing a novel. But when I started, I didn't think it was going to be a novel. When I started, I thought I was doing something of a biography of Helen Louise Langdon Little, and also thinking that I wanted to work with the digital, because I always have a curiosity about new forms, new methods and what they can teach me and how they might be used to convey what I want to say. So I started off there with the digital, but thinking in biographical terms. And the more I wrote and the more I researched, the more I realized that, some of this might be explored better in a work of fiction. So in essence, I ended up doing both. I finished the fiction, but I'm still working in other forms. So that I've learned that you can kind of move right across. And also that that does not take away from my interest in the oral as well. Because as I do the print, and I'm thinking as I'm writing things, and I'm thinking also of the voices that come to me, I find that I am looking for ways to put those voices on the page. So I end up speaking with researchers I didn't think had a particular interest in this project. For example, now I've just had lots of conversations with Morgan Delphinis, who is a researcher on Caribbean and African languages, because as I think of a saying coming from Grenada in the 19th century, I think, okay, there is a lot of the Creole, what in Grenada we would call the French Creole, but there's a lot of the, and of course, what the community generally refers to as the patois. So there's a lot of this here. I'm not sure how to write this. So I speak to Morgan, I speak to someone who was my student here as well, a Dominican called Lisa Latouche. So I end up doing a lot of work with individuals who know particular things, where language and other things are concerned better than I do. So I have learned a tremendous amount in that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what do you imagine what do you imagine you're giving to your readers when you say, okay, here's this volume of poetry, but now here's Grenada again in this novel in this way, and then here's Grenada again or the revolution again in The Color of Forgetting, and I'm doing something different here than what I did with Angel. And then in this series of poems, when Lady in a Boat, or in this essay, what do you hope that readers are taking away from that kind of experience?
I hope they're also taking away a sense of the historical that is behind it all. And here I was looking for two things, a quotation from Bell Hooks. And of course, Bell Hooks is one of the people that Tesfa had on the flyer as, informing ideas for this panel. Bell Hooks wrote, "To build community requires vigilant awareness of the work we must continually do to undermine the socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate notions of domination." So as you think of that, all right, and with my work, I'm also interested in speaking directly from the community and to the community. So this idea that to build community requires all of that. I think, for example, of how one of the things, as I wrote the novel that I just said I'm finished writing now, I researched the records of the Grenada Legislative Council. So as I'm creating a character in the novel, a character who appears in the novel as Sir, he's a teacher in a primary school, and he has all of these ideas that parents don't always agree with. And as I was constructing that character, as I was thinking about Sir, I was also thinking about the Legislative Council minutes of that period of the early 19th century. And in there, and here's a quotation, they're discussing, the governor and others in the Colonial Legislative Council are discussing what they will do about primary school education. And they decide that, look, most people in this country don't really need a whole heap of education. The rural people especially, let's just give them enough reading, writing, arithmetic to so that they will continue to be an agricultural population, So as I'm constructing Sir, and as I'm thinking of the rural and the urban people in that novel, I'm also thinking of ways in which we don't even realize how much we have been shaped by those ideas. So that in the Legislative Council, they say, the education, and this is a quotation, the education that the vast bulk of our peasantry needed to qualify them for their lot in life was a thorough training in the 3 R's. And then elsewhere they continue that they want to, that there is a need to, again, quotation, maintain a broad line of demarcation between the vast majority of pupils who would be thoroughly and exclusively trained in reading, writing, and arithmetic in what would be termed the lower division, that is lower division primary schools, and those others, and listen to this, comparatively few in number who were qualified by intellects to make further educational progress. And then they say in the purely rural districts, they would have schools in the lower division, while, and again a quotation, in the more important centers of population, meaning in the urban areas, where it might be expected that a few pupils desirous of qualifying for other walks in life than the agricultural laborer would be found, they would have upper division schools. So I'm thinking, look at this. Think of the Grenada, think of the rural-urban divide, think of rural areas and perceptions, think of urban areas, think of St. George's and perceptions of the countryside. And you see in the Legislative Council how these things were actually shaped. So we don't even realize today how much our ideas have been shaped by colonial attitudes, by colonial administrators who say, look, these country schools, don't give them too much. So perhaps in the town we might find a few people who could go beyond agriculture. So let's make sure we have, some kind of education for them, etc. So when you read things like this, I end up thinking, this is wonderful. I mean, wonderful in the sense that it's helping me to construct a teacher.
Mm.
But then I'm also thinking, I want the community to know more than just that this is a novel. I want to make people curious about what informs the construction of the novel so that people could go for themselves and read these historical documents. So, you know, I always have a sense of a connection between the material that I create, the individuals that I create, the characters in these novels, because Sir does not exist out there. So it's characterization, but I want the characterization to make people curious, to ask, did this happen?
Mm.
Or is this totally invented? So a lot of Sir is invented, but a lot of the history that informs the creation of Sir comes out of our legislative council, comes, you know, out of, I only mentioned the legislative council as one thing, but so that gives a sense of what I want people to get out of the novels, out of the poetry. An enjoyment of language, yes, but also, you know, the kind of historical scaffolding that is there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a wonderful example that you used because, you know, ironically, and you talk about, you know, we don't realize how we're influenced by these things. I remember growing up, my dad would say reading, writing, and arithmetic as if that was the foundation of an excellent education. Like that's when he's saying,
absolutely,
you know, you all need to get back to the basics of the reading, writing, and arithmetic. So it's interesting to hear that the perception in the Legislative Council was that that was going to be the least of education for, you know, the least important people. And the way that that rhetoric was actually taken up by folks, and, you know, my family is from St. David's, from the country, as, you know, well, this is the pride that we have in the education that we received and the foundations that we have. So it's, you know, it actually came to mean something different, I think, but it's interesting to know those roots. And the way that you've presented it, I'm fairly certain, you know, my dad would not have thought that the initial sort of impetus behind that was that that wasn't even for the colonial masters, the sort of real idea of education.
Right. Yeah, and thanks for that, because that, you know, as you make that comment, I also think of my mother today, who at 102 is still reciting snippets of the Royal Reader. You know, there are things that she remembers and she would suddenly say something. And some of these are not things I know. Yeah, because I also used the Royal Reader when I was in primary school. But obviously, the way that generation, my mother, my grandmother, Malcolm X's mother and grandmother, the way that they were taught in primary school was also very different from the way that we were taught. They were made to swallow whole chunks of the Royal Reader in ways that we were not. Yes, we had to learn some, because there are things I also remember from there, but they learned a whole heap more. You know, so, and now as I listen to her, because there are times my mother would say something even now, and I would go to Dr. Google, you know, to say, to find out, what is this? I'm sure this comes from somewhere. And very often it came from one of the Royal Readers. So, you know, so it's really interesting. And as you say, your dad, Laurie, would not have thought of this. I know that my mother would not think of that either. You know, that this was, you know, it was a deliberate way in which things were introduced. And you know, there's something else. Recently, when I know new politicians were talking about the urban-rural divide, or at least the probably didn't put it in those terms, but looking at one particular thing and saying that St. George's is not Grenada, that we have to aim things at the rural areas. I smiled because, of course, I was also thinking of my research and thinking we were trained to think that St. George's is Grenada. People don't realize that, so that, you know, when we say, for example, we use a term within academia like anti-colonial, you know, we're not necessarily thinking of our approach to community work in the country as having been influenced by colonialism. But when we look at what is said in the various councils, colonial, legislative, and other councils, we realize that, well, yeah, yes, it is. We are more colonial than we know, you know, and even in our attitudes to each other, not just rural-urban divide, but I'm thinking in attitudes of, well, in Grenada, it's not so pronounced because, for example, we had less smaller Indian populations in Grenada. But when you read the Legislative Council and other minutes from those, from the end of the 19th century there, you see how the attitudes of Africans to Indians and Indians to Africans, you know, how much those were shaped by colonial attitudes. So I always find it fascinating to go to the history while I'm writing.
So thinking about this history, and, you know, I'm always struck by the way that you contextualize your work. People might read Angel, for example, or we'll think about Angel as a novel about the Grenada Revolution, without necessarily realizing that the revolution is maybe the last third of the novel. And we have the first 2/3 of the novel, you know, you're referencing Aruba and Grenadian migrant workers there. You're referencing the 1950s and Sir Eric Gary and that whole political labor movement there. And so we have this context for the Grenada Revolution then that comes in Angel, where we have to understand this much earlier political movement and history before we come to the 1970s and the early 1980s. And so listening to you talk about this new novel on Louise Little, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how, you know, what you thought the scope of that project was going to be when you started it, and where have you actually gone with it in terms of the historical scope and the context that you're providing. You've already suggested that there was a lot of context you did in terms of thinking through language and thinking through, you know, what's happening in the legislative minutes. But what was the sort of frame for you historically to understand somebody like Louise Langdon Little?
Okay, thanks for that. And let me, in answering, bring in the Institute for People's Enlightenment a little bit, because when they invited me to speak in Grenada, and I decided to speak about Louise Langdon Little in 2019, it struck me that I was speaking at a center that had the name of her male relatives, her father's relatives, yeah? And of course, I didn't talk a lot about that at all, but, you know, it was always at the back of my mind. Because I suppose kind of knowing the landscape, you know, you can't separate one thing from the other. And let me say that I was also impressed by the fact that the Institute and Peter made this deliberate decision, you know, saying after I had spoken, not after I had spoken in St. George's, because he even said it before, that, we have to go to La Digue, of course, because that is where she's from, and we have to bring it to the community. And I ended up learning a lot myself from going there. So I just wanted to make that point, about academia and community, because my sense is that the Institute is very clear about wanting to make that link, and about, finding out as it goes along how academics writing about communities shouldn't just write about the communities and go off, but should find some way of engaging. So I thought that was wonderful. And when I first came to write this novel, the first motivation was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. So it took a lot of years. You read the autobiography, you go away, but the thoughts are there, some kind of gestation, something is happening in there. And in the autobiography, Malcolm says, and Malcolm, I always say Malcolm and Alex Haley, because people point out that, it's kind of biographical, autobiographical thing. Malcolm says that my mother, Louise Little, was born in Grenada in the British West Indies. And I remember when I first read that, I paused. I say, hold on here, this is my Grenada. This kind of, because you don't hear that as part of the narrative of Malcolm, And when I read that years ago, I kind of went away, thought about it, and there are little things in the novel, for example, which later on when I spoke to people, they said, oh, Malcolm wrote that, but it probably wasn't really so, not meaning they're born in Grenada. But one point where Malcolm in the novel says that his mother, he was the lightest child of all his family. And his mother would always tell him, go out into the sun and get some color. Go out into the sun, let the sun shine on you and get some color. Whenever the sun chose to appear in Michigan. So he says, and someone I was speaking to said, no, probably that's not, she wouldn't say something like that at all to him. And I thought, I hear that Caribbean voice. I can hear a Caribbean parent saying something like that. Child, go out in the sun and get some color. So just thinking through things like that and seeing other little details in the novel that made me think, hey, she wasn't just from Grenada. She remained connected. And then I remember Caldwell Taylor, who used to be ambassador in New York during the period of the revolution. I remember Caldwell Taylor in Canada saying to me, asking me if I had read anything by Malcolm's brother. And at the time I said no, and he guided me towards that work. He told me I should go to Montreal, which I did, trying to find her. So, and that kind of thing. So all of that explains how I came to the writing of, well, not to the writing of, but came to decide that I wanted to write something or to do something about this figure that was a Grenadian figure. And because I saw her, and the more I researched, the more I saw her not only as the mother of Malcolm X, whom everybody, of course, by this time had come to know of Malcolm X. I saw her not only as the mother of Malcolm X, but as in some ways representative of a lot of women in La Digue, and not just women in La Digue, of Grenadian women, particularly interested in the education and the shaping of her children. And I said, I'm sure there is something of that in there. Mm-hmm. So when I started, because I was at the time within MITH, Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, which is at the University of Maryland, I thought, I could use technology. I could develop a digital work on Louise Langdon Little. So that's where it started, with that idea of a digital work. And I should here mention Terence Wilson, who is a relative, a Langdon relative in Grenada. And I talked to Terence a bit about the story, the Grenada story, and I realized that members of the family had lots of different stories. The details didn't always agree. So the more I talked to Terence and other people, the more I thought, there is more than the digital work here. And eventually I came around to the idea of a novel as well. And perhaps the novel, because there were so many different stories that really did not agree. Various members of the family had stories that were diametrically opposed to each other. And I thought the best way to explore this perhaps is a work of fiction. Mm-hmm. So that's how, some of that idea developed. So right now it's a work of fiction. I've already written an essay that some people may have seen. So I already wrote an essay about that, about Louise Langdon Little. And then, of course, there are the other things. The fiction is complete. And I'm trying to think of various ways to use the voice as well.
Mm-hmm. Will you still pursue the digital project or no?
Yes.
Okay.
The digital project is ongoing.
Okay. Wonderful.
Yes.
So, speaking of the digital and your foray into the visual, I wanted to ask, about some of the work you've done on Big Drum and Saraka. And so, a lot of the dialogue in the earlier panel was about, how scholars and communities come together, how the Institute wants to facilitate that. And I think of you as a scholar who is part of the community, embedded in the community, not separate from the community. And I think that your work really highlights what scholars learn from the community. So it's not, scholars bringing knowledge to the community necessarily, but a kind of shared endeavor. So I wonder if you could say something about Big Drum, Saraka, and these rituals and festivals that are happening in Grenada and that have been happening for many, many years, and how these are spaces of learning that embody, historical memory and that show us how to practice community pedagogy, maybe in ways that, they're not being articulated in that way, but they are certainly a lived experience, I think, of the historical memory and the community pedagogy that the Institute is so interested in promoting and unearthing in Grenada.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can stop me if I'm not really answering your question, because there's so much in that question. But for example, when I think of Angel, I know that I have somewhere in the first part of Angel, there is a scene in which Dudzi and Angel, Angel, and perhaps also Simon, I think, are at a Saraka in Hermitage. And again, that's a community space. You have all of the questions about whether she should go to the Saraka. She's asking, and you see people passing, going up the road, calling out to her, asking her if she's ready, etc. And of course, I'm always interested in that interaction within the community itself, how people shout to each other. And eventually they are there, and Angel is eating off the banana leaf, of course, which is part of the Saraka sharing. So I think later on, when I came back to that idea, I was also thinking about that very small scene in Angel where the children are at the Saraka with their mother. And constructed around that are also all kinds of stories that the community is telling. People they're laughing at, people they are they're enjoying each other, etc. And then I spoke to Winston Freire in Carriacou about the Carriacou Big Drum. And Winston talked to me about both Big Drum and Saraka. And, I think it was as I was speaking to Winston, I decided this is not going to be, this cannot be just a written work. What I'm doing here is also, very visual, because I'm seeing people dancing the big drum. I'm hearing Winston doing all of that explanation. So you would see in the end, when I did that, when I came out with Saraka and Nation, you have the kind of interviews with Winston Freire, you have the big drum dance. And then I thought, as Winston spoke to me about the Saraka, and I remembered going to the River Sally Saraka, I thought, there are two different things happening here. What is going on? The River Sally Saraka is very different from the Saraka. It's different in significant ways to me from the Saraka that Winston is talking about. The idea of nation, as they speak about it in Carriacou, was different from the idea of nation that I was hearing in River Sally. So I ended up doing interviews in both River Sally and Carriacou, and eventually getting a sense that here, what we're talking about here is coming out of traditional African religion, but eventually the religious aspect is discounted because you have Christianity and you have people who don't want to think that whatever they're doing has a connection with traditional African religion, because they don't think positively about traditional African religion. So of course, this is also the shaping of the colonial subject, we might say. So, so I'm thinking about all of those things and interviewing people, and really fascinated, for example, when Miss Edgar in River Sally says to me that the drums have to be playing before the children can eat. But she's not talking about religion at all. So because this is all very secular. But now I'm thinking of the drums in a traditional African religious ceremony and all of that. And she's like, no. It's just that the drums have to play for the children to eat. So I asked her, why? Why do you have to have the drums for the children to eat? She said, well, that is it. The drums have to be playing. So it's so interesting to me because, of course, I'm looking for an explanation that might be religious, that might be secular, but this was her explanation. And so you can see how things change over the generations. That is the only explanation she had then. Whereas Winston, who had thought about this and perhaps studied it in different ways and was very conscious of and wanted to be conscious of the religious connection, talked to me about different African nations. So Winston, for example, would talk to me about the Yoruba. He would talk about Asante, different African nations that were part of the big drum. But although they say the word nation in River Sally, when I ask, what does nation mean to you? What is nation? I'm told, nation is nation. And that's the explanation. So it's not about African nations. So looking comparatively at Carriacou and River Sally, you could see how individuals change, how over the generations, I don't even want to say things get lost, but things get transformed. Things become transformed. Mm-hmm. People think of themselves as Grenadian and not as African, and not wanting to have too much connection there and all of that. So it's fascinating to me how the colonial project, in a sense, worked, and how, in the end, people's perceptions of themselves are rooted in something they think of as contemporary. So that's where Saraka Nation, all of the research, all of the filming, because I did filming in both Carriacou and River Sally. That's how all of that developed.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, I am learning also, because a lot of these things that Winston told me, I didn't know. But a lot of the things that Miss Edna and others in River Sally also told me, I didn't know. So I was seeing the kind of transformation of culture, you know, and how that happened on the ground. Mm-hmm. So I'm constantly learning from those interactions as well.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate the care that you take in there's like a companion essay to the documentary that you published, where you are very careful not to say, oh, such and such a aspect of the ritual is lost, but that you're very clear that it is transformed and that it means something different to the community at this moment. Right. So, you know, you're not discounting the way Miss Edgar is thinking about it, but you're pointing out that Winston Freire is thinking about it in this different way. And, yes, you know, in that space between Carriacou and Grenada and River Sally, something different has taken place. Is it historically connected? Sure, but you allow us as readers to make that connection so that we're not, you know, thinking about tradition as something that is static in the past, but that rather, you know, Saraka is something that is dynamic, it's changing, it's growing. And Absolutely. We don't have to be afraid of that kind of process.
Absolutely, it's always changing. And that makes me want to ask you something about how you come to your, you know, to your own critiques and to a fascination with these topics. Because, for example, now you're telling me, yes, you noticed that I was careful not to say one was wrong and one right, or, you know, and all of that. So talk to me about your interest in community and also in interrogating the work of particular scholars.
Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, similar to you, I've always had an interest in the historical. And it's interesting that you use the example of Angel and Doddsy bringing Angel to a Saraka, because family has always been the first place where I've started to learn about history. And I talk about this at the beginning of my book on Grenada, that it was really listening to women in my family talking, mostly the women in my family, talking about the revolution, that I started to piece together that information. And that the tensions in the revolution, all of that was already embedded in the conversations that I could overhear as a child, so that I knew, based on these kitchen table conversations, that, you know, the US invaded, there was something good about that to some people, but that the revolution was also lauded and so positive. And, you know, I'm seeing this picture of Maurice Bishop that is, you know, kept in our home and my grandmother's home. And so I understood that that was important. I understood the different relationships. And so I think, you know, I've always been curious about the history, and through education, I've loved coming to this work from a scholarly perspective and growing myself as a scholar. But I've always been aware that the foundation of a lot of that knowledge, or the seed for that knowledge for me, is planted not necessarily in an academic context, but in an intellectual context in the home. Mm-hmm. And that I have a lot to gain from that. So for instance, when I was thinking about your work on Saraka and Big Drum, I'd been doing some reading, and somewhere in some, you know, scholarly article I'd read, well, you know, another one of these traditions is Shango, but Shango is not practiced as much in Grenada anymore. And, you know, maybe it's mostly disappeared and it's in Trinidad more. And yeah, I ended up having a conversation with my mother about this, and she recalled going to a Shango as a child. Now, I would have never learned that if I hadn't been thinking about your work and asked her, have you been to Saraka? What do you know about that stone feast and things like that? And it came out of that conversation. So now for me, I can think, and my mother's from Syracuse. That becomes an interest for me, right? Where was this? Who in Syracuse was doing this, around this time? And if we're saying it's not being practiced in Grenada anymore, well, now I have a particular timeline that I can think about, my mom's childhood, and that's going to bring me into the research into a different way. Similarly, I've got sort of little bits from hearing you talk and reading your work on Aruba and the work of Grenadian migrant workers in Aruba. And that's a new interest for me. But where I first heard about that was knowing that my mom's father, my grandfather, was one of these migrant workers who'd gone to Aruba. And, people would say different things. We knew very little about what he had actually done there. And I thought it was some kind of agricultural work. And this is just growing up. And then now as a scholar, I look into it and I'm thinking, but there wasn't a lot of agricultural work happening in Aruba. And we got a copy of his passport. And it said that his training was actually in masonry. And so, so there for me, a seed is planted to find out more. What were the lives of these workers like? What happened? We think about migration in the Caribbean as a road to upward mobility. But based on what I know of my grandfather's life returning to Grenada, I don't know if that narrative maps on. I don't know that upward mobility was able to happen for him based on that experience. And so, those are just some of the examples of how anything that I'm doing in this academic context, any of these sort of intellectual questions for me are also very personal. And I've been really shaped by conversations in the family context, whether my family realizes what's happening or not. Sometimes when you're young, they say you fast, but that fast, I think, has really, fed me fed that sort of intellectual curiosity.
That's a fabulous answer. So fastness bring you far.
Yes.
And yes, there is that sense in which a lot of the stories, and you're talking about yourself as a critic and scholar, there's a sense in which a lot of that, whether for you as critic, for me as creative writer, a lot of that comes out of the stories we hear, and I'm going to use the word community again, from communities, beginning with parents, the parents, the aunts, the uncles, people around who are talking. And in my case, and it sounds like in your case as well, very often a lot of that talking was done by the women in the family. They are talking about their lives and sometimes they ask the men questions or they say things to the men and the men answer, So that again helps us to delve into the history. And it's fascinating to me to listen to your story about it, because there again, we have the history. I remember on one occasion, for example, my mother, and I think I've written this somewhere, but, we always have to give the credit there, because in my case, I could dedicate each book to my mother, because so many stories that she pulled out of other people have an influence on, the way I create things, or even her reactions to the voices, her reaction to the way I would laugh in one particular case, and the way she would hear me laughing from far and decide, that kind of laugh over there. You understand what I'm saying? So even those responses make you want to find out more about the social. And I'm remembering, for example, in one case when my mother, I was asking my father questions and he's not answering. I mean, he's kind of answering, but not really, you know. And I remember my mother saying, "Tell her now, tell her about nigger yard." And I said, "What?" And he said, "She always on with something." But then afterwards, bit by bit, he comes out with the story of a place that he lived that was called exactly that, you know? And of course, then I am ready to find out more about this place, to find out exactly where in Grenada this is located and why they called it that and all of that. So sometimes little things, you know, in the narrative help us to do the unfolding of the history and to understand a particular location, you know. It's, for me, made me understand that particular location in a special way, because now I knew what it was called in the past. I connected it with the estate and, you know, and was able to do kind of more work on the estate. So that those stories that come from the home spaces and very often come from the lips of the women, in my case, or sometimes from the men who are pushed by the women, you know. So as we're talking about feminist pedagogies here, and I'm thinking of what Bell Hooks said about the need to, you know, to understand systems of domination and where they are created. You know, I'm thinking of all of that. I think of my mother. I think of my aunts. I think of my father too. Because, and of course, Bell Hooks' point is that we're talking about understanding for all people. We're not talking about understanding for women alone, but if we're getting the stories from the women, you know, it is important to plumb those stories and to understand what they're telling us about us and about the wider society.
Absolutely. I'm just noting the time, and I'm wondering if TESFA wants to allow for any questions from the audience, or because I realize we're almost at one.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful that Dr. Laurie Lambert, who is also a member of my PhD committee, and Dr. Merle Collins, our dear beloved Professor Emerita, answered the call to be a part of this today and embody so beautifully precisely the kind of conversation that we want to continue in this space around where our knowledge is, from where our knowledges emerge. And so much of what we call community is women's work, for sure, and women's conversation and what we hear at the dinner table. If you will allow us, I've asked you to be here for an hour, and the hour is upon us. But if you will allow us just about 5 to 10 more minutes for questions, I would be grateful if you're open to that. Okay, yes. Thank you. All right. So as I said before, questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can come up here to ask. We'll also take questions in the chat. So maybe I have a question. Just last evening, we had a session with Dr. Wendy Grenade and Dr. Damian Graves in Grenada around our fast approaching 50th anniversary of independence and what that means. And one of the conversations that emerged out, one of the things that emerged out of that conversation was the idea of intergenerational knowledge transfer and how we sort of create future generations of thinkers and scholars within the Grenadian context, and and we see a beautiful embodiment of that right in front of us. So I would invite the two of you to speak to that for us.
Sorry, I let you start. Or I ask you to start.
Oh, sure. Well, I mean, a lot of what I learned from the intergenerational dialogue, I learned from the conversations that I see in your work, Professor Collins. I'll say, you know, the relationship between Angel and Dodzi, between Angel and her father. And it was so funny to me recently. I was talking to somebody about a scene from the book where there's a photo of Eric Gary in the house and Angel hides it and destroys it and her father gets upset. And the person basically told me the exact same thing had happened in their household. So, you know, I'm really encouraged by that model, and that, you know, the more people read your work, I think the more they'll understand the importance of an ongoing dialogue between generations, and that even if one generation is doing it differently from the other, that we do have to, you know, give the younger generation a platform and allow them to make certain things their own. And I think that this is something we're seeing played out in Grenadian politics right now, with the new prime minister. And so I think that, you know, it's happening, and it would be helpful for us to actually spotlight that as a conversation so that we learn less painful ways of having these intergenerational conversations. Because I think one of the lessons from our history is that when the conversation doesn't happen, it can be fatal, right? And it can be really painful.
Yes. And yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think in a way, the Institute now is facilitating those intergenerational conversations too, by bringing people into the communities, and also bringing the communities to people. You know, so that I really like what is happening there, that connection. So I think the Institute is doing some work there. And as I listen to you, Laurie, I think of a comment by the scholar Brian Meeks, who is Jamaican, who was in Grenada during that period of the revolution, saying that that because of how things ended in Grenada, it will be generations before something similar happens in the Caribbean, you know? And as I'm looking at the ways that I think they're happening now, I think it's people are articulating themselves, saying things in different ways. But sometimes when I hear the things, when I hear the perspectives, I smile and I say, okay, it's not dead. Yeah, you know, there are things there. Because I think that that the idea is passing from generation to generation. I think that is extremely important. And as I think of the Institute, I think that it is important for scholars to give the basic research information that they're getting, that basic research information does not just stay on our shelves and on shelves in universities, but they're actually communicated back to the community. And I believe that we can see that it has been happening over the years, and that the work of organizations like this, like the Institute, is really important.
Thank you very much for that. We have another question from Professor Osian Jasor, who is also a member of my PhD committee. I have my whole crew here today. Thank you so much.
Oh, is that big a bit? Okay, can you guys hear me? Thank you so much, Dr. Collins and Dr. Lambert. I am Osian Jasor from TESFA's committee and assistant professor in sociology and anthropology here at Concordia University. And hearing you talk about feminist pedagogies and the importance of, the mundane and the intimate as a point of departure for creating knowledge, right? About the Caribbean and beyond. I suppose my question is what sort of arguments or maybe can you speak of the richness or the novelty maybe of the arguments that you are able to formulate because of that point of departure, because of feminist pedagogies and methodologies, maybe as opposed to more masculinist methods of knowledge production or ways of arriving at the arguments that you make about the revolution and about Grenada and the Caribbean as a whole. And I know you discussed it during this talk, but if you could maybe say a little bit more, because this is something that I'm interested in my own work as well.
I guess I would just go back and say briefly, and then Laurie, I'll let you jump in, but I will just remind briefly about the quote I gave from bell hooks, that to build a community requires vigilant awareness of the work we must continually do to undermine all this socialization that leads us to behave in ways that perpetuate past dominant ideologies. And I stick with that because I believe, it also leads us to history. And I'm thinking too of, it leads us to history, it leads us to all of the knowledge that we are getting. I'm thinking too of a quotation from Walter Rodney. What was it again? A quotation from Walter Rodney, not from Walter Rodney, from Paulo Freire about liberation. Liberation, not a gift, not a self-achievement. I can't find it, but that's it. Liberation, not a gift, not a self-achievement, but a mutual process. And I think that leads us back to the whole idea of what Bell Hooks is talking about when she talks about feminist pedagogies. So it's not a self-liberation, that all of the academic work is not just for yourself. Yes, my finding out all of these things might turn on a light bulb and make me say, that is how we are. But that is why we are the way we are. But it's not just a gift for me. It has to be a gift for everybody. So that, and in the beginning, people mightn't even believe, but then when they read what is actually there and see, these were the things they were saying, this comes out of there. That's why we have these ideas. So that I believe that these, looking at the intimate, looking at the personal, looking at these little details, and then reading also the historical, reading also the way that that colonialists were working to help us develop certain ideas, makes us understand why other people are the way they are, why we are the way we are, why we have certain attitudes within our communities, etc., and work towards those.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is I think that feminist pedagogy allows us to be more capacious and creative in terms of where we think this kind of learning takes place. And, I think about a story that George Lamming shared in a speech that he gave in Grenada, I believe it was in 1982, and it was basically about his mother and the sacrifices that she made for his education, and reflecting on how he came to, through his education, to, study Marx and things like that, but that his mother didn't need to study Marx to understand the principles of socialism and anti-colonialism and the kind of radical equality that Lamming sort of envisioned as part of a really important political project for the Caribbean. And so I think feminist pedagogies can also bring us to that place where we understand that we have ways of dealing with these problems that are indigenous to our region and to the imagination and the thinking of our own intellectuals, and that there's a value in that. And I think that, our feminist thinking has given us more space and permission to tap into those different kinds of knowledge and epistemologies.
Thank you very much. We're going to be true to our word and keep you to the 10 minutes extra that you promised. I am very, very, again, happy, very full to have had a morning of wonderful conversation, first with the members of the IPE in that community, and second, this wonderful panel on feminist pedagogies with two of my favorite Grenadian thinkers, two people who continue to inspire me to think more deeply about these things. And I thank you, the audience who were here with us in person. Thank you for braving. Today we're almost at -40 in Montreal, so thank you for braving the Montreal winter and coming to be with us. Thank you for all of you who joined us on Zoom this morning. We're very, very happy that you have stayed on as long as you have to. I believe we reached a peak of about 50 some odd people on Zoom this morning. So we're really, really happy for the interest that you've shown in thinking with us about what Grenada can teach us. We believe that this is the beginning of a conversation that's going to be ongoing. And we are very excited for the support that we've received from the members of Protest and Pedagogy, from the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, and from the Institute for People's Enlightenment in Grenada. Somebody's telling me on Zoom that we peaked at 60, so makes me even happier. Thank you so much again. For those of you who are with us in-house, we should be having a few snacks in a little bit, but thank you so much again, Dr. Merle Collins, Dr. Laurie Lambert, Mr. Peter Antoine, Mr. Simon Green, and Ms. Dr. Loruna Lewis, who were with us for this morning's panels. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers.